Murder in Her Own Handwriting. A Miss Marple Mystery, Chapter 1. The Letter That Arrived at Dawn. Welcome to Velvet Clues, where mysteries unfold like silk in moonlight. I'm Connor, and tonight we follow the sharp mind of Miss Jane Marple through one of her most perplexing cases. Before we begin, I'd love to know what draws you to detective stories. Is it the puzzle, the characters, or perhaps the satisfaction of justice served? Share your thoughts in the comments below. Now, settle in with your favorite evening beverage as we enter the seemingly peaceful village of St. Mary Mead, where even the Morning Post can deliver deadly secrets. Miss Jane Marple was enjoying her customary morning tea when the peculiar letter arrived. It was a Tuesday in late September, and the autumn mist still clung to the hedgerows surrounding her cottage garden. She had been contemplating whether to deadhead the remaining roses when Florence, her faithful maid, appeared with the Morning Post balanced on a silver tray. "Only 3 letters today, Miss Marple," Florence announced, setting the tray beside the delicate china teacup. "2 look like bills, but this one—" She hesitated, her weathered fingers hovering over an cream-colored envelope. "This one's rather odd, if you don't mind me saying." Miss Marple set down her teacup with its characteristic gentle clink and examined the envelope in question. Indeed, there was something immediately unsettling about it. The paper was of excellent quality, the sort used for formal correspondence, yet it bore no return address. Her name and direction were written in an elegant, flowing script that seemed oddly familiar, though she couldn't immediately place where she might have encountered it before. "Most curious," she murmured, adjusting her spectacles. "Hand-delivered by the look of it. No postmark." With the careful precision of someone who understood that small details often held great significance, Miss Marple opened the envelope. Inside was a single sheet of matching stationery, covered in the same elegant handwriting. As her eyes scanned the contents, her expression shifted from mild curiosity to profound concern. The letter read, "I can no longer live with what I have done. The guilt has become unbearable. I killed Vivienne Moorcock 3 days ago, and I cannot face the consequences of my actions. By the time you read this, I will have taken my own life. I pray that God will forgive me for both my crimes." It was signed, in that same flowing script, Margaret Fairfax. Miss Marple read the confession twice, her mind already noting the oddities that distinguished this from any ordinary suicide note. Margaret Fairfax was known to her by reputation, a respected widow who had moved to the neighbouring village of Much Benham some 18 months prior. She was said to be writing her memoirs, something about her experiences during the war years when she had worked in the Foreign Office. "Florence," Miss Marple called, though her maid had already retreated to the kitchen. "I wonder if you might telephone Dr. Haydock for me. Tell him it's rather urgent." While she waited for the doctor's arrival, Miss Marple studied the letter more carefully. The paper quality was indeed excellent, and the ink appeared to be from a proper fountain pen rather than a ballpoint. Yet something about the letter troubled her beyond its disturbing contents. The handwriting, while elegant, seemed somehow laboured, as though the writer had been taking unusual care with each stroke. Dr. Haydock arrived within 20 minutes, his familiar sturdy presence bringing a sense of reliability to the morning's unsettling developments. He was a man of perhaps 60 years, with the kind of practical wisdom that came from decades of tending to both the physical and emotional ailments of country folk. "Miss Marple," he said, settling his medical bag beside his chair, "Florence mentioned some urgency. Nothing serious, I hope." "I'm afraid it may be very serious indeed," she replied, handing him the letter. "This was delivered this morning, apparently by hand." Dr. Haydock read the confession with growing alarm, his ruddy complexion paling as he absorbed its implications. "Good heavens, Margaret Fairfax. But I spoke with her just yesterday at the post office. She seemed perfectly normal, discussing her garden and asking about the church flower rota." "That's precisely what troubles me," Miss Marple observed. "In my experience, people contemplating suicide and confession rarely concern themselves with flower arrangements." "Tell me, doctor, What do you know of Mrs. Fairfax's current circumstances? The doctor considered the question carefully. She's been working on her memoirs, as I understand it. Something about her wartime service. Keeps quite to herself, though she's always pleasant enough when one encounters her in the village. Lives alone in Rosemary Cottage with just a daily woman who comes in 3 times a week. Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully. And this Vivienne Moorcock mentioned in the letter, are you familiar with the name? I believe she was a visitor staying with Mrs. Fairfax. Arrived perhaps a week ago, though I never met her personally. Dr. Haydock paused, frowning. Miss Marple, surely we should notify the police immediately. If this letter is genuine. Oh, I quite agree that the authorities must be informed, Miss Marple replied. However, I have a rather strong suspicion that this letter is not what it appears to be. The handwriting troubles me considerably. She moved to her writing desk and withdrew a sheet of her own correspondence. You see, Doctor, I received a note from Mrs. Fairfax just last week, thanking me for the marrow I sent over. The handwriting is undoubtedly the same, yet she held the 2 documents side by side. There's something different about the formation of certain letters, almost as though someone were copying rather than writing naturally. Dr. Haydock examined both samples with the careful attention of someone accustomed to noting subtle variations in human behavior. By Jove, you're right. This confession shows signs of deliberate imitation. Precisely, Miss Marple agreed. Which suggests that either Mrs. Fairfax is not the author of this confession, or she wrote it under circumstances that made natural penmanship difficult. Neither possibility bodes well for the lady's welfare. As the morning sun climbed higher, burning away the last of the mist, Miss Marple found herself contemplating the darker possibilities that the letter suggested. If Margaret Fairfax had not written the confession, then someone else had taken considerable trouble to replicate her handwriting. And if there truly was a body waiting to be discovered in Much Benham, then they were dealing with a crime far more complex than a simple murder-suicide. The peaceful morning had transformed into something altogether more sinister. And Miss Marple suspected that before the day was through, the quiet villages of St. Mary Mead and Much Benham would be thrust into the centre of a mystery that would challenge even her considerable experience with the darker aspects of human nature. Chapter 2: The Cottage with Drawn Curtains. The journey to Much Benham was accomplished in Dr. Haydock's reliable motor car, with Inspector Slack following in the police vehicle. Miss Marple had suggested their immediate investigation, and both men had readily agreed that the circumstances warranted swift action. The morning air held that crisp quality peculiar to early autumn, with leaves just beginning to show their first hints of gold and amber. Rosemary Cottage proved to be a charming stone dwelling set back from the village lane behind a well-tended garden. Climbing roses adorned the front wall, their late blooms providing splashes of pink and white against the weathered stone. Yet, despite its picturesque appearance, something about the cottage immediately struck Miss Marple as wrong. The curtains, she observed, as they approached the front gate. Every window on the ground floor has its curtains drawn tight. Rather unusual for someone who was supposedly contemplating suicide yesterday evening. Inspector Slack, a man whose efficiency often overcame his natural skepticism regarding Miss Marple's observations, nodded approvingly. Quite right. Makes one wonder what someone might be trying to conceal. The front door stood slightly ajar, another detail that added to the atmosphere of abandonment that seemed to pervade the property. Dr. Haydock knocked firmly, calling out Mrs. Fairfax's name, but received no response. After a reasonable interval, Inspector Slack pushed the door open and stepped into the entrance hall. The interior of Rosemary Cottage presented a scene of remarkable orderliness. Unlike many homes where tragedy has struck, everything appeared to be in its proper place. The sitting room, visible through an open doorway, showed no signs of disturbance. Books were neatly arranged on their shelves, cushions properly plumped, and a small writing desk positioned near the window remained tidy, except for a single fountain pen lying precisely parallel to the desk's edge. Too tidy, Miss Marple murmured, causing both men to look at her with interest. In my experience, people in emotional distress rarely maintain such perfect housekeeping. Even the most meticulous individuals allow small disorders to accumulate when their minds are troubled. They proceeded through the cottage systematically, Inspector Slack leading the way with the professional caution of someone accustomed to potentially dangerous situations. The kitchen revealed further evidence of the cottage's unnaturally pristine condition. Not so much as a teacup remained in the sink, and the tea towels hung with mathematical precision from their hooks. It was in the study that they made their first significant discoveries. The room clearly served as Mrs. Fairfax's writing space, with a substantial oak desk positioned to catch the morning light. A typewriter sat prominently in the center of the desk, an elderly but well-maintained Remington that appeared to have seen considerable use. The memoir she was working on, Dr. Haydock observed, noting the neat stack of typed pages beside the machine. Quite substantial by the look of it. Miss Marple approached the typewriter with interest, immediately noticing what the others had missed. "Inspector," she called softly, "you might find this significant. The ribbon has been removed from the machine." Inspector Slack examined the typewriter carefully. Indeed, the ribbon mechanism was empty, showing clear signs that the ribbon had been recently extracted. Curious thing to do if one were contemplating suicide. Why bother removing a typewriter ribbon? Perhaps, Miss Marple suggested gently, because the ribbon contained impressions of recently typed material that someone preferred to remain hidden. She moved to examine the manuscript pages, scanning the topmost sheets with interest. The memoir appeared to focus on Mrs. Fairfax's wartime experiences in the Foreign Office, with particular attention to a scandal involving leaked intelligence that had apparently resulted in several court-martials and at least one suicide. "Fascinating reading," she observed. "Mrs. Fairfax seems to have possessed considerable inside knowledge of some rather sensitive wartime events. Names, dates, specific incidents that were presumably classified at the time." Dr. Haydock joined her in examining the manuscript. She mentioned several prominent figures here. Politicians, military officers, civil servants. Some of these people are still alive, still in positions of influence. "Precisely," Miss Marple agreed. "The sort of revelations that might prove extremely uncomfortable for certain individuals, particularly if Mrs. Fairfax possessed documentary evidence to support her claims." Inspector Slack had continued his examination of the room's contents, paying particular attention to any signs of disturbance. Near the window, he discovered something that brought him up short. "Miss Marple, Dr. Haydock, you'll want to see this." Behind the heavy curtains, the window showed clear evidence of forced entry. The latch had been manipulated from the outside, and there were scratches on the window frame that suggested the use of some sort of tool. Most significantly, the carpet beneath the window bore the faint impression of muddy footprints, though someone had made an attempt to clean them. "So much for suicide," Inspector Slack concluded grimly. "Someone gained entry to this cottage, and they were careful to clean up after themselves, though not quite careful enough." Miss Marple knelt beside the window to examine the footprint impressions more closely. "A man's shoes, I would estimate, size 10 or 11, with a distinctive wear pattern on the left heel. And see here," she pointed to a small smudge near the windowsill, "traces of red clay, rather unusual for this area, where the soil tends to be more sandy." As they prepared to continue their search of the cottage, Miss Marple found herself troubled by the growing evidence that Margaret Fairfax had been the victim of a carefully planned crime. The forced entry, the missing typewriter ribbon, and the unnaturally pristine condition of the cottage all pointed to someone who had taken considerable trouble to arrange the scene according to their own design. Yet the most troubling aspect remained the confession letter itself. Someone had possessed not only samples of Mrs. Fairfax's handwriting, but also the skill necessary to replicate it convincingly. Such preparation suggested a level of premeditation that spoke to motives far more complex than simple burglary or opportunistic violence. The cottage held its secrets close, but Miss Marple was confident that patient observation and careful deduction would eventually reveal the truth. Somewhere within these ordered rooms lay the key to understanding what had become of Margaret Fairfax, and why someone had found it necessary to silence her permanently. The morning sun, now higher and stronger, streamed through the disturbed curtains, illuminating the scene of what was clearly a very carefully orchestrated crime. Chapter 3. The Garden's Silent Witness. The search of Rosemary Cottage's interior had yielded disturbing evidence of careful manipulation, but it was the garden that would provide Miss Marple with the most crucial clues. Inspector Slack had insisted on examining the grounds systematically, and his thoroughness proved most illuminating. The cottage garden was laid out in the traditional English manner, with neat borders of perennials framing a central lawn and a kitchen garden tucked discreetly behind a yew hedge. Apple trees, heavy with fruit, provided dappled shade over a wrought iron bench positioned to catch the afternoon sun. It was a peaceful, well-tended space that spoke of its owner's devotion to growing things. Yet even here, careful observation revealed signs that all was not as it should be. "The rose bed has been disturbed," Miss Marple noted, pointing to an area near the cottage's rear wall, where the soil showed clear evidence of recent digging. "See how the earth has been turned and then carefully smoothed. Someone has taken considerable trouble to restore the appearance of the bed, but the roses themselves tell a different story." Dr. Haydock bent to examine the plants she indicated. Several of the rose bushes showed signs of having been recently transplanted, their roots disturbed and their foliage showing the stress of interrupted growth, as though someone dug something up, then replanted to conceal the disturbance. Inspector Slack was already directing his constables to begin careful excavation of the suspicious area. The work proceeded slowly, with each spadeful of earth examined for any unusual contents. It was Miss Marple, however, who made the next significant discovery, though it came from an entirely different part of the garden. "Inspector," she called from near the garden's boundary hedge, "I believe you should examine this more closely." She was kneeling beside a patch of herbaceous border, where the plants showed clear signs of having been trampled. Among the damaged foliage, something metallic caught the light, half buried beneath fallen leaves and debris. Inspector Slack approached with interest, carefully extracting the object with his handkerchief. It was a pair of reading glasses in a distinctive tortoiseshell frame, the lenses cracked but still intact. The glasses bore the unmistakable signs of having been dropped and subsequently stepped upon, their twisted frame speaking to some struggle or violent encounter. "Mrs. Fairfax's glasses, almost certainly," Dr. Haydock observed. "I've seen her wearing identical frames on several occasions. She was quite particular about them, as I recall, had them specially fitted in London." Miss Marple accepted the glasses for closer examination, noting details that the others had missed. "The prescription appears to be quite strong, suggesting that Mrs. Fairfax was significantly dependent upon these for reading and close work. Most unlikely that she would venture far from the cottage without them, particularly if she were engaged in writing, which supports our theory that she met with foul play," Inspector Slack concluded. "The question remains, where is Mrs. Fairfax herself?" The answer to that question came within the hour, as the systematic excavation of the rosebed yielded its grim secret. Constable Blake, working with meticulous care under Inspector Slack's direction, had penetrated perhaps 2 feet into the disturbed soil, when his spade struck something that was unmistakably not earth or root. "Inspector," he called quietly, "I believe we've found her." The subsequent revelation confirmed their worst fears. Margaret Fairfax had been buried in her own garden, wrapped in what appeared to be a heavy blanket, and placed in a grave that had been dug with considerable care and skill. The soil had been replaced, and the rose bushes replanted with such attention to detail that the disturbance might never have been noticed by a casual observer. Dr. Haydock's preliminary examination revealed that Mrs. Fairfax had died from a single blow to the head, delivered with sufficient force to cause immediate unconsciousness and death within a short time. There were no signs of defensive wounds, suggesting that she had been taken completely by surprise. "The attack occurred in the early evening, I would estimate," Dr. Haydock reported after his initial examination. "Perhaps 3 or 4 days ago, which would align with the timeline suggested in the confession letter." Miss Marple found herself studying the scene with the careful attention she habitually applied to complex puzzles. The location of the grave, tucked behind the cottage where it would be invisible from the lane, suggested that the killer possessed intimate knowledge of the property's layout. The care taken in replanting the roses indicated someone with gardening experience, or at least sufficient patience to research proper techniques. The confession letter was intended to buy time, she observed. Someone wanted to ensure that Mrs. Fairfax's disappearance would be attributed to suicide rather than murder, at least long enough for them to complete whatever business required her silence. Inspector Slack was examining the surrounding area for additional evidence when he made another significant discovery. Near the garden gate, partially concealed beneath a privet hedge, lay a small notebook bound in red leather. The pages within contained what appeared to be research notes in Mrs. Fairfax's handwriting, covering the same wartime events detailed in her memoir. Names, dates, references to specific documents, Miss Marple observed, as she examined the notebook's contents. Mrs. Fairfax appears to have been extremely thorough in documenting her claims. See here, she mentions possession of certain letters and photographs that would substantiate her allegations. The notebook's final entries, dated just days before Mrs. Fairfax's death, made for particularly interesting reading. They detailed a meeting with someone identified only as VM, presumably the Vivienne Moorcock mentioned in the confession letter. The notes suggested that this meeting had been arranged to discuss the memoir's publication and its potential consequences for certain named individuals. Vivienne Moorcock appears to have been more than a casual visitor, Miss Marple concluded. Mrs. Fairfax seems to have trusted her with considerable information about the memoir's contents. The question becomes, was Miss Moorcock an ally, or an adversary? As the afternoon light began to slant lower through the apple trees, Miss Marple found herself contemplating the complexity of the crime they were investigating. The careful preparation, the attention to detail, and the sophisticated attempt at misdirection all suggested a killer who possessed both intelligence and intimate knowledge of Mrs. Fairfax's circumstances. The garden, which had appeared so peaceful upon their arrival, had revealed itself to be the scene of calculated murder. Yet Miss Marple suspected that the cottage and its grounds held additional secrets, and that the truth about Margaret Fairfax's death would prove to be even more complex than their initial discoveries suggested. Chapter 4: Ink That Tells No Lies. The revelation of Margaret Fairfax's murder transformed the investigation from a puzzling suicide note into a complex homicide inquiry. Inspector Slack had immediately dispatched constables to secure the scene and notify the county authorities, while Dr. Haydock arranged for the body's proper removal. Miss Marple, however, found her attention drawn back to the confession letter that had started their investigation. "Inspector," she said, producing the letter from her handbag, "I believe this document deserves considerably more scrutiny than we've been able to give it thus far." The handwriting analysis was only the beginning. They had returned to the cottage's study, where the afternoon light streaming through the windows provided excellent conditions for detailed examination. Miss Marple positioned herself at Mrs. Fairfax's writing desk, spreading the confession letter beside several other samples of the deceased woman's correspondence that Inspector Slack had gathered from the cottage. "The handwriting match is indeed remarkable," she observed, "but there are subtleties that become apparent only with careful comparison. Notice how the letter is formed differently in the confession versus Mrs. Fairfax's natural writing. In her genuine correspondence, the tail of the ink extends with a confident flourish. In the confession, it's more restrained, as though the writer were being deliberately careful." Dr. Haydock leaned over her shoulder to examine the samples, as though someone were copying, rather than writing naturally. "Precisely," Miss Marple agreed. "But there's something else that troubles me even more than the handwriting inconsistencies." She held the confession letter up to the light, examining it from various angles. "The ink shows variations in color intensity that suggest it was written over a period of time, with several pauses between sections." Inspector Slack joined them at the desk, his interest clearly piqued. "You mean it wasn't written in a single sitting?" "I believe it was written in at least 3 separate sessions," Miss Marple replied, pointing to subtle variations in the ink's darkness.
See how this paragraph shows a slightly different shade. And here, the final signature shows the darkest ink of all, as though the pen had been freshly filled. The implications of this observation were significant. Someone planning a genuine suicide would hardly write their confession in multiple sessions over several days. The fragmented composition suggested careful planning and deliberate construction, further supporting their theory that the letter was a fabrication designed to misdirect the investigation. "There's something else," Miss Marple continued, producing a small magnifying glass from her handbag. The paper itself shows evidence of having been dampened and dried, leaving faint watermarks along the edges. Combined with the ink variations, this suggests that someone may have used a technique to artificially age the document, or perhaps to facilitate the copying process. Dr. Haydock looked puzzled. How would dampening paper help with copying handwriting? "If you dampen paper slightly," Miss Marple explained, "it becomes more receptive to ink transfer." Someone could have traced Miss Fairfax's handwriting from another document, using the dampened paper to ensure a clean transfer. The multiple ink applications would then be attempts to darken the traced lines and make them appear more natural.
Inspector Slack was making careful notes of these observations when they were interrupted by the arrival of Constable Wright, who had been conducting interviews with Mrs. Fairfax's neighbours. His report added another layer of complexity to their investigation. The Daily Woman, Mrs. Jenkins, confirms that Mrs. Fairfax had a visitor staying with her, he reported. Young lady named Vivienne Moorcock arrived about a week ago. Dark hair, well dressed, spoke with what Mrs. Jenkins described as a refined accent. "And when was Miss Moorcock last seen?" Miss Marple inquired. "That's the curious thing," Constable Wright replied. "Mrs. Jenkins saw her leaving the cottage early Tuesday morning carrying a suitcase. She appeared to be in quite a hurry, didn't stop to exchange pleasantries as she usually did." Miss Marple felt a familiar stirring of intuition that told her they were approaching a crucial breakthrough. "Tuesday morning would have been the day before I received the confession letter. Most suggestive timing. There's more," Constable Wright continued. Mrs. Jenkins mentioned that she'd observed Miss Moorcock spending considerable time in Mrs. Fairfax's study during her visit. Said she often saw lights burning there late into the evening, and on one occasion noticed Miss Moorcock examining documents at the desk. The picture that emerged from these revelations was deeply troubling. Vivienne Moorcock had possessed access to Mrs. Fairfax's writing materials, had been present during the crucial period leading up to the murder, and had departed hastily on the morning that coincided with the confession letter's composition. "Inspector," Miss Marple said thoughtfully, "I believe we should examine Mrs. Fairfax's personal papers more systematically. If Miss Moorcock was indeed researching the memoir's contents, she may have left traces of her activities that could help us understand her true purpose here." Their search of the cottage's remaining documents proved illuminating. Hidden in a drawer of Mrs. Fairfax's bedroom dresser, they discovered a collection of wartime correspondence that appeared to form the foundation for many of the memoir's most sensitive revelations. The letters, bearing official government seals and high-level signatures, contain detailed discussions of intelligence operations, personnel decisions, and cover-up efforts that would indeed prove highly embarrassing to several prominent figures. "My word, Doctor," Haydock breathed, examining one particularly damaging document. "If this information were made public, it would destroy several reputations and possibly result in criminal charges. Exactly the sort of material that might motivate someone to commit murder," Inspector Slack observed grimly. "The question becomes, was Vivienne Moorcock working on behalf of one of the individuals named in these documents?" Miss Marple was studying the correspondence with particular attention to the handwriting and signatures. Her expression had grown increasingly thoughtful as she examined each document in turn. Finally, she looked up with the air of someone who had reached an important conclusion. "Gentlemen," she said quietly, "I believe we may have been approaching this investigation from entirely the wrong direction. The evidence suggests that Vivienne Moorcock was not merely a visitor to this cottage but someone with a very specific mission related to these documents." The late afternoon sun was beginning to cast longer shadows through the study windows as Miss Marple prepared to share her emerging theory about the true nature of Margaret Fairfax's murder. and the mysterious woman who had vanished so conveniently on the morning after the crime. Chapter 5. The Typewriter's Missing Voice. The discovery of the wartime correspondence had provided crucial insight into the potential motives for Margaret Fairfax's murder, but Miss Marple remained troubled by the missing typewriter ribbon. Such a seemingly minor detail, yet her experience had taught her that the smallest elements often proved most significant in solving complex crimes. "Inspector," she said, returning her attention to the Remington typewriter that dominated Mrs. Fairfax's desk, "I believe this machine may hold the key to understanding what our killer was truly after." She examined the typewriter with the careful attention of someone who understood the mechanics of such devices. The ribbon mechanism showed clear signs of recent use, with ink residue visible on the guide arms, yet the ribbon itself had been removed with considerable care, leaving no torn fragments or casual damage that might result from hasty extraction. Whoever removed this ribbon possessed some knowledge of typewriter mechanisms, she observed. The extraction was performed properly, suggesting either familiarity with such machines or sufficient time to work carefully. Dr. Haydock looked puzzled. "But why would anyone want to steal a typewriter ribbon? Surely such a thing has little value." "Ah, but consider what a typewriter ribbon contains," Miss Marple replied with a slight smile. "Every character typed leaves an impression on the ribbon. With sufficient patience and the right equipment, one could potentially read the most recently typed documents by examining the ribbon's impressions." Inspector Slack's expression sharpened immediately. "You mean someone could reconstruct Mrs. Fairfax's recent correspondence by studying the ribbon?" "Precisely. If Mrs. Fairfax had been typing sensitive material related to her memoir, particularly correspondence with publishers or additional manuscript pages, those impressions would remain on the ribbon for some time." The implications of this revelation were significant. The killer had not simply murdered Mrs. Fairfax to prevent publication of her memoir, they had also taken steps to acquire any additional materials she might have produced recently. The theft of the typewriter ribbon suggested a level of sophistication that spoke to careful planning and specific knowledge of documentary evidence procedures. Miss Marple moved to the window where Mrs. Fairfax's reading glasses had been discovered in the garden below. The broken spectacles provided another piece of the puzzle that had been troubling her throughout the investigation. The glasses were found near the boundary hedge, she mused, some distance from the cottage itself. This suggests that Mrs. Fairfax was outside when she was attacked, perhaps attempting to flee from her assailant. Or perhaps she was lured outside, Inspector Slack suggested. Someone she trusted asking her to step into the garden for a private conversation. Dr. Haydock nodded thoughtfully. That would explain the lack of defensive wounds, if she was struck from behind while her attention was focused elsewhere. Exactly, Miss Marple agreed. And the location where we found the glasses suggests the attack occurred near the garden's rear boundary, well away from any potential witnesses on the lane. Constable Wright returned with additional information from his neighborhood interviews, bringing news that further complicated their understanding of events. Mrs. Patterson from the adjacent cottage reports hearing voices from Mrs. Fairfax's garden on Monday evening, he announced. Two women engaged in what she described as a heated discussion, though she couldn't make out the specific words. The timing aligns with our estimates of when Mrs. Fairfax was killed, Inspector Slack observed. Did Mrs. Patterson provide any description of the voices? She recognized Mrs. Fairfax's voice naturally. The other voice belonged to a younger woman speaking with what Mrs. Patterson described as a cultured accent. The conversation appeared to grow quite animated before ending abruptly. Miss Marple found this information particularly significant. A heated discussion followed by sudden silence. Most suggestive. Did Mrs. Patterson observe anything else that evening? She mentioned seeing a light moving through Mrs. Fairfax's cottage later that night, as though someone were searching the rooms with a torch. The light appeared to spend considerable time in the study. The pattern of events was becoming clearer with each new piece of information. Vivienne Moorcock had engaged Mrs. Fairfax in a confrontation that had ended in murder, then had spent the night systematically searching the cottage for specific materials. The theft of the typewriter ribbon was part of a comprehensive effort to acquire any evidence that might support Mrs. Fairfax's memoir claims. The forged confession letter served multiple purposes, Miss Marple observed. It provided time for Miss Moorcock to complete her search, delayed the discovery of the body, and created a false narrative that would discourage thorough investigation. Inspector Slack was reviewing his notes when a thought occurred to him. Miss Marple, you mentioned that the confession letter showed signs of being written in multiple sessions. Could this have been done to match typing impressions on the stolen ribbon? An intriguing possibility, she replied. If Miss Moorcock had access to equipment that could read the ribbon impressions, she might have been copying specific phrases or sentences that Mrs. Fairfax had recently typed. That would explain both the careful handwriting and the fragmented composition. Dr. Haydock looked disturbed by the implications. You're suggesting that the killer not only murdered Mrs. Fairfax but also possessed sophisticated intelligence-gathering capabilities. I'm suggesting that this crime was planned and executed by someone with access to resources far beyond those of an ordinary criminal, Miss Marple replied gravely. The precision of the handwriting forgery, the knowledge of documentary analysis techniques, and the careful staging of the scene all point to professional expertise. As the afternoon shadows lengthened across the cottage study, Miss Marple found herself contemplating the true scope of the conspiracy they were uncovering. Margaret Fairfax had died not simply because she possessed embarrassing information, but because she had threatened to expose secrets that certain parties were willing to kill to protect. The missing typewriter ribbon represented more than evidence theft. It was a symbol of the lengths to which powerful individuals would go to silence inconvenient truths. Somewhere in London or elsewhere, that ribbon was being analyzed by experts who would use its contents to identify and neutralize any additional threats to their interests. The peaceful cottage study, with its afternoon sunlight and scholarly atmosphere, had become the center of a web of deception that stretched far beyond the boundaries of Much Benham. Miss Marple sensed that solving Margaret Fairfax's murder would require unraveling connections that reached into the highest levels of government and society. Chapter 6: Shadows from Whitehall. The investigation had reached a point where Miss Marple felt they needed to understand more about Margaret Fairfax's wartime service and the sensitive information she had intended to reveal. Inspector Slack had arranged for access to Mrs. Fairfax's personal papers, and among them they discovered a collection of documents that painted a troubling picture of corruption and cover-ups within the highest levels of government. These files detail a systematic effort to suppress information about intelligence failures that led to significant Allied losses, Miss Marple observed, carefully examining a folder marked Personal Confidential. Mrs. Fairfax appears to have kept meticulous records of meetings, conversations, and decisions that certain individuals would prefer to remain buried. Dr. Haydock peered over her shoulder at the documents. Good heavens, some of these names, several are still prominent in government and business. The implications, if this information became public, would be devastating. Inspector Slack finished grimly. We're not just dealing with historical embarrassment here. Some of these revelations could result in criminal charges even after all these years. Among the papers they discovered correspondence between Mrs. Fairfax and various publishers, indicating that she had been actively seeking publication for her memoir. The letters revealed that several publishers had expressed serious interest but also significant concern about the legal implications of printing such explosive material. She was planning to proceed with publication despite the risks, Miss Marple noted. This letter from Blackwood and Associates indicates they were prepared to accept her manuscript provided she could supply adequate documentation to support her claims. It was then that they found the letter that would prove most illuminating. Hidden between the pages of a wartime diary, they discovered a recent communication from someone signing themselves simply as V. The handwriting was distinctly feminine and the content was both friendly and subtly threatening. Dearest Margaret, the letter read, I hope you will reconsider your decision to proceed with publication. Certain parties remain deeply concerned about the potential consequences not only for themselves but for national security interests that transcend personal considerations. Perhaps we might meet to discuss alternative arrangements that would satisfy your desire for historical accuracy while avoiding unnecessary damage to reputations and ongoing operations. Miss Marple examined the letter carefully, noting details that the others had missed. The paper stock matches that used for the confession letter, and the ink appears to be from the same fountain pen. Most significantly, notice how certain letter formations match those in the forged confession. "You're suggesting this V is our Vivienne Moorcock?" Inspector Slack asked. "I'm suggesting that whoever wrote this letter also wrote the confession. The handwriting styles are different, but certain unconscious habits remain consistent. See how the cross on each T slopes slightly downward and how the dots above each are positioned slightly to the right. These are automatic movements that are extremely difficult to disguise even when one is deliberately altering their handwriting." Dr. Haydock studied the letter with renewed interest. "The tone is polite, but there's an underlying menace. Ongoing operations suggests this involves more than historical reputation." "Precisely," Miss Marple agreed. "I believe we're dealing with someone who represents current intelligence interests, not merely individuals concerned about past embarrassments." The reference to national security indicates that Mrs. Fairfax's revelations threatened contemporary operations as well as historical reputations. Inspector Slack was making careful notes when Constable Wright arrived with information that would prove crucial to their understanding of Vivienne Moorcock's true identity. "Inspector, I've been making inquiries about Miss Moorcock through official channels. The name appears to be an alias. No record of anyone by that name in the hotel registers of nearby towns and no train bookings under that identity. However," he continued, producing a small notebook, "the station master at Much Benham recalls selling a ticket to London on Tuesday morning to a young woman matching Miss Moorcock's description. She paid in cash and appeared anxious to catch the earliest available train." Miss Marple found this information highly significant. A professional using an assumed identity departing by the fastest possible route after completing her mission. "This confirms our theory that we're dealing with someone far more sophisticated than a casual acquaintance of Mrs. Fairfax. There's more," Constable Wright added. "I contacted Scotland Yard about any ongoing investigations involving wartime intelligence matters. Detective Chief Inspector Morrison mentioned that they've been tracking several attempts to suppress publication of memoirs dealing with sensitive wartime operations. Apparently this isn't an isolated incident. The implications were staggering. Margaret Fairfax had not been the victim of a single murderer acting alone, but rather part of a systematic campaign to silence anyone who threatened to expose uncomfortable truths about wartime intelligence operations. The sophistication of the crime, the forged confession, the careful staging, the theft of documentary evidence all pointed to resources and expertise available only to government-level operations." "Inspector," Miss Marple said thoughtfully, "I believe we should examine Mrs. Fairfax's telephone records. If Vivienne Moorcock contacted her to arrange their meeting, there may be traces of communication that could help us identify her true affiliations." The telephone records obtained through official channels revealed a pattern of calls that supported their emerging theory. Mrs. Fairfax had received several calls from London numbers during the week before her death, including 2 lengthy conversations on the day before Vivienne Moorcock's arrival. "The timing suggests coordination," Inspector Slack observed. "Someone in London was orchestrating Miss Moorcock's visit and providing her with detailed information about Mrs. Fairfax's activities and schedule." Dr. Haydock looked troubled by the implications. "Are you suggesting that government agents murdered Mrs. Fairfax to prevent publication of her memoir?" "I'm suggesting that certain individuals with access to official resources were prepared to commit murder to protect their interests," Miss Marple replied carefully. "Whether they were acting with official sanction or pursuing their own agenda remains to be determined." As evening approached, casting longer shadows through the cottage study, Miss Marple found herself contemplating the broader implications of their discoveries. The murder of Margaret Fairfax represented more than a single crime. It was evidence of a systematic effort to rewrite history and suppress inconvenient truths. The stolen typewriter ribbon, the forged confession, and the professional execution of the crime all pointed to a conspiracy that reached into the highest levels of power. Somewhere in London, powerful individuals were monitoring their investigation and planning their next move.
The peaceful village of Much Benham had become the center of a struggle between truth and power, between historical accuracy and contemporary convenience. Miss Marple sensed that their investigation had attracted attention from quarters that possessed the resources and ruthlessness to eliminate anyone who threatened their interests. Yet she remained determined to pursue justice for Margaret Fairfax regardless of the powerful forces arrayed against them. The truth had a way of emerging even when buried beneath layers of official deception and bureaucratic manipulation. The challenge would be uncovering that truth before those responsible could complete their efforts to erase all evidence of their crimes. Chapter 7. The Publisher's Dilemma. Miss Marple had spent a restless night contemplating the implications of their discoveries. By morning she had reached the conclusion that their investigation required expansion beyond the immediate crime scene. If they were to understand the full scope of the conspiracy against Margaret Fairfax, they needed to trace the connections between her memoir and the powerful interests that had moved to suppress it. "Inspector," she announced over breakfast at the village inn, "I believe we should pay a visit to Blackwood and Associates, the publishers who expressed interest in Mrs. Fairfax's manuscript. Their correspondence suggests they were in regular contact with her during the final weeks of her life." Inspector Slack agreed readily, recognizing that their investigation had moved beyond ordinary police work into territory that required careful political navigation. The journey to London was accomplished by the morning train, with Dr. Haydock accompanying them to provide medical expertise if needed. Blackwood and Associates occupied a distinguished Georgian building in Bloomsbury, its elegant facade speaking to decades of successful literary publishing. Mr. Charles Blackwood, the firm's senior partner, received them in his panelled office with evident concern about the circumstances of their visit. "Mrs. Fairfax's death is indeed tragic," he acknowledged after Inspector Slack had explained the nature of their investigation. "She was a remarkable woman with an extraordinary story to tell. Her memoir would have made a significant contribution to our understanding of wartime intelligence operations." Miss Marple noted the careful phrasing of his response. "You speak in the past tense, Mr. Blackwood. Had you decided against publication?" Blackwood hesitated, his expression troubled. Mrs. Fairfax's manuscript presented certain challenges. While the historical value was undeniable, the legal implications were considerable. Several individuals named in her account remain alive and in positions of influence. The potential for liable actions was substantial. "Yet your correspondence indicated willingness to proceed," Inspector Slack observed. "What changed your mind?" "We received certain communications that caused us to reconsider," Blackwood admitted reluctantly. "Official inquiries about the manuscript's content, suggestions that publication might conflict with ongoing national security interests. Nothing explicit, you understand, but the implications were clear." Dr. Haydock leaned forward with interest. "Are you saying the government pressured you to withdraw your offer?" "I'm saying we received advice from sources that we felt obliged to consider seriously," Blackwood replied carefully. "The publishing business requires maintaining positive relationships with various official bodies. Antagonizing the wrong people can have severe consequences for one's ability to operate." Miss Marple recognized the delicate position in which Blackwood found himself. Publishers depended on government goodwill for various permissions and privileges, making them vulnerable to subtle pressure that stopped short of outright censorship. The threat to Mrs. Fairfax's memoir had come not through dramatic confrontation but through quiet bureaucratic influence. "Did Mrs. Fairfax know of your decision to withdraw?" she inquired. "We had scheduled a meeting to discuss the situation," Blackwood said sadly. "She was to come to London this week to review our concerns and discuss possible modifications to the manuscript. Of course, that meeting will never take place now." Inspector Slack was taking careful notes when an idea occurred to him. "Mr. Blackwood, do you still have Mrs. Fairfax's manuscript?" "We haven't found a complete copy among her papers." "Certainly. We maintain secure copies of all manuscripts under consideration." Blackwood moved to a substantial safe in the corner of his office, extracting a thick folder bound with ribbon. "I should warn you the contents are quite explosive. Mrs. Fairfax documented systematic corruption and cover-ups involving some very prominent figures. The manuscript proved to be even more damaging than their earlier discoveries had suggested." Mrs. Fairfax had possessed documentary evidence of deliberate intelligence failures, falsified reports and criminal negligence that had resulted in numerous Allied casualties. Names, dates and specific incidents were detailed with the precision of someone who had maintained meticulous records throughout her government service. "My word," Dr. Haydock breathed, reading over Miss Marple's shoulder. "If these allegations are accurate, several current government ministers were directly involved in covering up intelligence failures that cost hundreds of lives." "More importantly," Miss Marple observed, "Mrs. Fairfax claims to possess original documents that would prove these allegations beyond doubt, letters, memoranda, and photographs that she kept as insurance against future retaliation." Inspector Slack looked up from his examination of the manuscript. "Yet we found no such documents at her cottage. Either she hid them extremely well or Vivienne Moorcock's real mission was to locate and acquire those materials," Miss Marple finished. "The murder may have been secondary to document retrieval." Blackwood nodded grimly. "Mrs. Fairfax mentioned keeping her most sensitive materials in a safety deposit box. She was quite paranoid about security, understandably given the nature of her revelations. This information provided a new dimension to their investigation. If Mrs. Fairfax had indeed secured her most damaging evidence in a bank vault, then Vivienne Moorcock's mission remained incomplete. The murder and document theft at the cottage had eliminated one threat, but the most dangerous materials might still exist. "Do you know which bank?" Inspector Slack asked urgently. "She never specified, though she did mention using a facility in London. Said it was safer to keep the materials away from her home given the potential for interference." Miss Marple was studying the manuscript's final pages when she noticed something significant. The last entry is dated 3 days before Mrs. Fairfax's death. She writes about receiving a telephone call from someone claiming to represent interested parties who wish to discuss alternative arrangements regarding publication. Vivienne Moorcock's initial contact, Inspector Slack concluded. She represented herself as a mediator when she was actually an assassin. "The sophistication of the operation is remarkable," Dr. Haydock observed. "Creating a false identity, establishing credible cover for extended contact with the victim, then executing both murder and evidence destruction with professional efficiency."
As they prepared to leave Blackwood's office, Miss Marple found herself troubled by the implications of what they had learned. The conspiracy against Margaret Fairfax involved not only murder but systematic suppression of historical truth. Powerful individuals were using official resources to eliminate threats to their reputations and ongoing interests. "Mr. Blackwood," she said, as they gathered their materials, "I hope you will reconsider your decision about publication. Mrs. Fairfax died trying to reveal important truths about our recent history. Her sacrifice should not be in vain." Blackwood looked conflicted. "If the authorities can provide assurance that publication would not conflict with legitimate security interests, we would certainly reconsider. However, given the current circumstances, the afternoon train back to Much Benham provided time for reflection on their London discoveries. Miss Marple gazed out at the passing countryside, contemplating the challenges they faced in pursuing justice against adversaries who possessed virtually unlimited resources and official protection. Yet she remained determined to honor Margaret Fairfax's memory by ensuring that the truth eventually emerged regardless of the powerful forces arrayed against them. Chapter 8. The Safety Deposit Box. The revelation that Margaret Fairfax had secured her most sensitive documents in a London safety deposit box provided new urgency to their investigation. Miss Marple understood that if those materials still existed, they represented both crucial evidence for solving the murder and potential targets for continued suppression efforts. "Inspector," she said, during their train journey back to Much Benham, "I believe we must locate that safety deposit box before others do. If our theories about professional involvement are correct, the same parties responsible for Mrs. Fairfax's death will be working to identify and secure any remaining evidence." Inspector Slack nodded grimly. "The problem is that London has dozens of banks offering such services. Without more specific information, we could spend weeks searching." Dr. Haydock, who had been studying Mrs. Fairfax's personal correspondence during the journey, suddenly looked up with interest. "I may have found something relevant here." In a letter to her solicitor dated last month, She mentions updating her will and ensuring proper arrangements for access to important materials held in trust at Cott's Bank, Miss Marple observed with satisfaction. An excellent choice for someone concerned about security. Their Strand location has served the government and aristocracy for generations. If Mrs. Fairfax wished to ensure her materials remained safe from unofficial interference, she could hardly have chosen better. Upon their return to Much Benham, Inspector Slack immediately contacted his superiors to arrange official access to Mrs. Fairfax's safety deposit box. The process required delicate navigation, as any formal request would alert the same government circles that had already demonstrated their willingness to suppress Mrs. Fairfax's revelations. While they awaited authorization, Miss Marple suggested examining Mrs. Fairfax's cottage once more, focusing on any clues that might reveal exactly what materials she had considered worth protecting with such elaborate security measures. Their second search of the cottage study proved more fruitful than their initial investigation. Hidden behind a collection of gardening books, they discovered a leather portfolio containing photocopies of some of the documents referenced in Mrs. Fairfax's memoir. While not originals, these copies provided insight into the scope and significance of the materials likely stored at Cott's. Intelligence assessments deliberately falsified to conceal operational failures, Miss Marple observed, examining one particularly damaging document. Orders countermanded without proper authorization, resulting in unnecessary casualties, and here correspondence discussing the elimination of witnesses who might testify about these failures. Dr. Haydock studied a series of photographs that accompanied the documents. These show the aftermath of operations that were officially reported as successes. The discrepancy between official accounts and photographic evidence is staggering. Inspector Slack had been examining what appeared to be a personnel file when he made a discovery that connected directly to their current investigation. Miss Marple, look at this. A classified memorandum discussing the recruitment of special operatives for assignments requiring ultimate discretion in handling security threats. The memorandum, dated just 2 years prior, outlined procedures for identifying and eliminating individuals who possessed information that could damage ongoing intelligence operations. The language was euphemistic, but the implications were clear. Assassination was an accepted tool for protecting government secrets. The organization that killed Mrs. Fairfax operates with official sanction, Miss Marple concluded. Vivienne Moorcock wasn't a rogue agent acting independently, but part of an established program for eliminating security threats. Late that evening, Inspector Slack received authorization to examine Mrs. Fairfax's safety deposit box, though with restrictions that reflected the sensitive nature of the materials involved. A senior official from the Home Office would accompany them, ostensibly to ensure that any materials affecting national security were handled appropriately. I don't like it, Inspector Slack confided to Miss Marple. Having a government representative present means we can't be certain that all evidence will be preserved for our investigation. Then we must ensure we document everything thoroughly before any materials can be confiscated, Miss Marple replied. I suggest we bring Dr. Haydock's camera and take comprehensive photographs of any documents we discover. The following morning found them at Cott's Bank in the Strand, accompanied by Mr. Geoffrey Richardson from the Home Office, a thin, precise man whose manner suggested considerable familiarity with sensitive government operations. His presence confirmed Miss Marple's suspicions about official involvement in Mrs. Fairfax's death. The safety deposit box contained materials that exceeded even their most pessimistic expectations. Mrs. Fairfax had assembled a comprehensive archive of intelligence failures, cover-ups and criminal negligence spanning 3 decades of government operations. Original documents, signed orders, classified photographs, and recorded testimonies created an indictment of systematic corruption and incompetence at the highest levels. Remarkable collection, Mr. Richardson observed, though his tone suggested more concern than admiration. Of course, much of this material remains classified under the Official Secrets Act. Public disclosure would be quite impossible. Miss Marple was photographing documents as quickly as possible while Dr. Haydock maintained a careful inventory of the box's contents. Inspector Slack, meanwhile, was examining materials specifically related to recent intelligence operations, looking for connections to the organization that had eliminated Mrs. Fairfax. "Here's our confirmation," Inspector Slack announced, discovering a file labeled Special Operations Domestic Security. The documents within detailed assignments given to operatives like Vivienne Moorcock, including specific instructions for handling publication threats posed by former government employees. "Mrs. Fairfax wasn't the first," Dr. Haydock observed, reading over the inspector's shoulder. "There have been at least a dozen similar operations over the past 5 years, all targeting individuals who possessed embarrassing information about government activities." Mr. Richardson had grown noticeably uncomfortable as the scope of Mrs. Fairfax's evidence became apparent. "Gentlemen, I must insist that these materials be turned over to appropriate authorities for proper evaluation. Some of these documents could compromise ongoing operations if they fell into the wrong hands." "I'm afraid that's not possible," Inspector Slack replied firmly. "These materials constitute evidence in a murder investigation. They'll remain in police custody until the case is resolved." The tension in the small vault room was palpable as Miss Marple completed her photographic documentation. She had captured images of the most damaging documents, creating a record that would survive even if the originals were subsequently suppressed or destroyed. As they prepared to secure the materials for transport to police headquarters, Miss Marple reflected on the magnitude of the conspiracy they had uncovered. Margaret Fairfax had died not simply because she threatened individual reputations, but because she had documented systematic criminality within the highest levels of government. The safety deposit box had contained enough evidence to topple governments and expose decades of official misconduct. Yet Miss Marple suspected that their discovery had also marked them for the same treatment that had befallen Mrs. Fairfax. The same organization that had eliminated one inconvenient witness would not hesitate to deal with others who threatened their secrecy. The struggle for truth and justice was entering a new phase, one that would test their courage and resourcefulness against adversaries who possessed virtually unlimited power and absolutely no scruples about using it. Chapter 9. The Hunters become the hunted. The tension following their examination of Mrs. Fairfax's safety deposit box was immediately apparent. Mr. Richardson's barely concealed agitation during the documentation process had made it clear that their investigation had penetrated deeper into sensitive territory than certain parties found comfortable. Miss Marple was not surprised when, upon their return to Much Benham, they discovered evidence that their own activities were now under scrutiny. "Someone has been through my rooms at the inn," Dr. Haydock reported grimly. "Nothing obviously missing, but my papers have been disturbed and my camera case was examined. Professional work. If I hadn't been looking for signs of intrusion, I might never have noticed." Inspector Slack's own lodgings showed similar evidence of careful search, confirming that their investigation had attracted unwelcome attention from the same organization responsible for Mrs. Fairfax's death. The searchers had been skilled enough to avoid obvious detection, but thorough enough to examine every possible hiding place for sensitive materials. "They're looking for the photographs we took at Coates," Miss Marple observed, "which means our documentation represents a significant threat to their interests. We must assume that our movements are being monitored and our communications intercepted." The gravity of their situation became apparent that evening when Constable Wright arrived at Miss Marple's cottage with disturbing news. "Inspector, I've been ordered to report to headquarters in London tomorrow morning. Temporary reassignment to assist with a special investigation. No details provided, but the order came through very high channels. Divide and conquer," Inspector Slack concluded. "They're systematically removing everyone involved in the Fairfax investigation from the scene. I wouldn't be surprised if I receive similar orders shortly." Miss Marple had anticipated such developments. Years of observing human nature had taught her that powerful individuals under threat would use every available resource to protect themselves regardless of legal or ethical constraints. The conspiracy against Margaret Fairfax had now expanded to include anyone who might expose the truth about her murder. "Inspector," she said quietly, "I believe we should take immediate steps to ensure our evidence survives even if we're prevented from pursuing the investigation further. The photographs and documents we've assembled must be preserved and distributed where they cannot be suppressed." Dr. Haydock nodded approvingly. I've already made copies of the most crucial materials and secured them with my solicitor in London. Multiple copies stored in different locations with instructions for publication if anything happens to us. Their precautions proved prescient. The following morning brought official orders transferring Inspector Slack to a remote posting in Scotland, effective immediately. The reassignment was presented as a promotion, but its timing and destination made its true purpose obvious. They want me as far from London as possible, Inspector Slack said bitterly. By the time I could return, all evidence will have disappeared and the case will be officially closed as suicide based on the confession letter. Miss Marple had been expecting such developments, but she was not prepared for the news that Constable Wright brought upon his return from London. His report revealed the full extent of the conspiracy working against them. The Fairfax case has been transferred to Special Branch, he announced. All local investigations are to cease immediately. Official conclusion: Mrs. Fairfax committed suicide after murdering an unknown visitor, whose body was subsequently disposed of by persons unknown. Vivienne Moorcock has been written out of the official record entirely, Dr. Haydock observed, as though she never existed. More troubling still, Constable Wright continued, I was told that continued discussion of the case could result in prosecution under the Official Secrets Act. Apparently Mrs. Fairfax's wartime service involved classified materials that remain sensitive. The machinery of official suppression was working with remarkable efficiency. Within 48 hours of their discovery of Mrs. Fairfax's evidence cache, the entire investigation had been shut down and those responsible for uncovering the truth had been scattered or silenced. Yet Miss Marple was not discouraged. Her experience had taught her that truth had a way of emerging despite official attempts at suppression. The key was ensuring that enough evidence survived in enough different hands to make complete suppression impossible. Gentlemen, she announced, I believe the time has come for unconventional action. If official channels have been compromised, we must pursue justice through alternative means. Her plan involved contacting journalists, international human rights organizations and foreign intelligence services that might have interest in exposing British government corruption. The photographs and documents they had secured would be distributed widely enough to ensure that eventual publication became inevitable. They can suppress 1 or 2 leaks, Miss Marple explained, but they cannot suppress dozens of leaks occurring simultaneously across multiple countries and organizations. The truth about Margaret Fairfax's murder will emerge even if we're prevented from pursuing it through normal police channels. Dr. Haydock had been maintaining contact with sympathetic colleagues in the medical community, some of whom had connections to international organizations concerned with government accountability. Inspector Slack, despite his impending transfer, retained contacts within law enforcement who might be willing to pursue unofficial inquiries. As they prepared to implement their strategy of distributed disclosure, Miss Marple reflected on the irony of their situation. The same government that preached about the rule of law and democratic accountability was systematically murdering its own citizens to protect the reputations of corrupt officials. Margaret Fairfax had died trying to expose the truth about government criminality spanning decades. Her murder had been carried out by an organization that operated with official sanction while maintaining complete deniability. The confession letter, the document theft and the professional execution had all been designed to erase her voice permanently. Yet their investigation had uncovered evidence that would ultimately prove more damaging than Mrs. Fairfax's original memoir. The systematic nature of the suppression efforts, the involvement of active government operatives, and the willingness to commit murder to protect official secrets created a story that transcended historical embarrassment. The hunters had indeed become the hunted, but Miss Marple was confident that truth would ultimately prevail over power. The evidence they had gathered would survive, and Margaret Fairfax's sacrifice would not be in vain. Chapter 10: Truth Will Out. 6 months after Margaret Fairfax's murder, Miss Marple sat in her cottage garden watching the early spring bulbs emerge from their winter dormancy. The Morning Post had brought news that vindicated her faith in the ultimate triumph of truth over official deception. The Times of London carried a front-page story detailing systematic government corruption spanning 3 decades, based on documents leaked simultaneously to newspapers in 12 different countries.
The official response had been swift denials and claims of national security concerns, but the evidence was too comprehensive and well documented to suppress. Margaret Fairfax's name appeared prominently in the coverage, her murder now recognized as part of a broader pattern of elimination targeting government critics. The confession letter that had initially misdirected their investigation was exposed as a sophisticated forgery, one element in a systematic campaign of deception. Dr. Haydock arrived for their customary morning tea, bringing additional newspapers that continued the story's coverage. The European Parliament is calling for formal investigations, he reported with satisfaction. Several governments are offering sanctuary to potential witnesses who fear for their safety. The distributed evidence strategy had worked exactly as Miss Marple had predicted. No single government or organization could suppress leaks occurring simultaneously across multiple jurisdictions and news organizations. The truth about official assassination programs, historical cover-ups, and systematic corruption had emerged despite desperate efforts at containment. Inspector Slack telephoned from Edinburgh, Dr. Haydock continued. He's been recalled to London to assist with the official investigation into the assassination program. Apparently his documentation of the Fairfax case has become crucial evidence for parliamentary hearings. Miss Marple smiled with quiet satisfaction. The inspector's forced exile had ultimately protected him from retaliation while preserving crucial evidence for eventual disclosure. His meticulous police work had provided the foundation for exposing a conspiracy that reached into the highest levels of government. "And what of our mysterious Vivienne Moorcock?" she inquired. "Arrested yesterday in Geneva attempting to board a flight to South America. Her real name is Victoria Marlowe, a former MI6 operative who specialized in wet work assignments. She's agreed to cooperate with international investigators in exchange for immunity from prosecution." The woman who had murdered Margaret Fairfax was finally in custody, though her arrest had come through international rather than British authorities. Her testimony would provide additional confirmation of the systematic nature of the assassination program and the official sanction under which it operated. Constable Wright had been restored to his position in Much Benham after the scandal forced resignations throughout the intelligence community. His report on the case's aftermath provided insight into the broader consequences of their investigation. 17 senior officials have resigned or been dismissed, he informed them during his visit that afternoon. The Prime Minister has announced a complete review of intelligence operations and accountability measures. Parliament is considering legislation to prevent future cover-ups. Yet Miss Marple understood that institutional change would come slowly, if at all. The same mentality that had produced the assassination program would seek new methods for protecting official secrets and eliminating inconvenient witnesses. Vigilance would be required to prevent similar programs from emerging under different names and structures. The most important outcome, she reflected, is that Margaret Fairfax's story has finally been told. Her courage in documenting government corruption has contributed to exposing systematic criminality that might otherwise have continued indefinitely. The cottage study where they conducted their informal post-mortem had become a symbol of successful resistance to official oppression. The same careful observation and logical deduction that Miss Marple applied to village mysteries had proven effective against sophisticated government conspiracies. Dr. Haydock raised his teacup in a toast, to Margaret Fairfax and to the principle that truth will ultimately prevail over power. As spring continued to unfold in the gardens of St. Mary Mead, Miss Marple reflected on the lessons learned from their investigation. The most elaborate deceptions could be unraveled through patient observation and careful analysis. Official authority could not ultimately suppress evidence that was properly preserved and distributed. Yet she also understood that their success had come at considerable cost. Margaret Fairfax had paid with her life for attempting to expose historical truths. Others had risked their careers and safety to ensure that evidence survived official suppression efforts. The peaceful village setting where their investigation had begun now seemed somewhat illusory. The same forces that had murdered Margaret Fairfax operated throughout British society, protecting official secrets through intimidation, deception, and, when necessary, elimination. Miss Marple's experience with the Fairfax case had revealed the extent to which government power could be corrupted and the lengths to which corrupt officials would go to protect their interests. Yet it had also demonstrated that truth possessed its own power, one that could ultimately overcome even the most sophisticated attempts at suppression. The confession letter that had started their investigation lay framed on her study wall, a reminder that even the most carefully crafted deceptions contained flaws that careful observation could detect. Margaret Fairfax's handwriting, copied but not perfectly replicated, had provided the first clue that led to exposing an entire network of government criminality. As evening approached, Miss Marple sat by her window watching the last light fade over the village she had called home for so many years. The tranquil scene belied the darker truths about power and corruption that their investigation had revealed, yet it also represented the possibility of justice and accountability that made their efforts worthwhile. Margaret Fairfax's memoir would finally be published, her revelations contributing to a broader reckoning with historical misconduct and contemporary corruption. The truth about her murder had emerged despite systematic efforts at suppression, vindicating the principle that justice, though sometimes delayed, would ultimately prevail. The mystery that had begun with a forged confession letter had evolved into something far more significant, a demonstration that ordinary citizens armed with careful observation and unwavering determination could successfully challenge even the most powerful forces of official deception. In a world where truth was increasingly under siege, that was perhaps the most important lesson of all. Thank you for joining us for another investigation with Miss Marple here on Velvet Clues. The truth may be buried, but it can never be destroyed. It only waits for those brave enough to unearth it. Until our next mystery, this is Connor reminding you to keep your eyes open and your mind sharp. Justice may be delayed, but it will not be denied.